Hello everybody, and welcome back to Witch's Castle. I'm Will Castle, and today we've got a new deck tech for you today, but before we get into it, I just want to give everybody a quick reminder to go ahead and click the subscribe button down below. If you've seen any of my videos before, you know I talk about Magic. I'm planning on talking about some other stuff down the line, anything gaming related. So if you're interested in those kinds of things, feel free to click the subscribe button. Give this video a like for me. It helps boost the algorithm, gets more eyes on the video, helps me get more feedback. And if you go ahead and click the subscribe button, you should ring the bell so that you get all the notifications going forward. Now, let's get into our deck today. Spoilers have kind of started for the Dragonstorm set for Tarkir, and we've got one of the commanders spoiled for us recently. It's Teval, the Balanced Scale. And I saw this card and immediately was overcome with joy. I adore all of the mechanics on this card, and I love big dumb dragons, and this set releases in April. April is my birth month, so it feels super cool. I am very excited to get my hands on this card and talk to you guys about what I've put together so far in what I'm calling the preliminary list for Teval. Starting with Teval himself. He is a 4/4 Spirit Dragon who costs 1, a black, a green, and a blue. And he's a flyer and says whenever he attacks, mill 3 cards. Then you may return a land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard, create a 2/2 black zombie druid creature token. Yeah, okay. This is kind of an inverse of the Sidisi that came out in the original Tarkir set. Sidisi attacks and mills you 3 cards, and you can get a creature back from among the milled cards. And then whenever you mill a creature, you get a 2/2 zombie. I believe that's how that one works. I could be mistaken, but it's an inverse of that. It's supposed to be a riff, basically, of that. That's how it feels, anyway. But I am a big lands guy. My 2 favorite card types in Magic are lands and creatures. Lands was the first ever commander deck I built that felt kind of uniquely mine, and I really liked it. I built a Mina and Den Wildborn commander deck, and it was one of my first commander decks that I actually saw success with. So lands have kind of stuck with me, and there's been a lot of cool lands coming out. You've probably seen some of my other deck techs. I work in some weird gimmicky land style effects into them. This card just does everything I want it to as a card. So we'll get into it. We've got 2 Planeswalkers in the deck. Both of them are a Wrenn. We have Wrenn and Realmbreaker. It's a 3-mana Planeswalker. It says lands you control can tap for 1 mana of any color. The +1 is up to 1 target land you control becomes a 3/3 elemental creature token with vigilance, hexproof, and haste until your next turn. It's still a land. The -2 is mill 3 cards. Put a permanent card from among the milled cards into your hand. And the -7 is you get an emblem with you may play lands and cast permanent spells from your graveyard. For me, there's 2 immediately relevant effects on this one. We've talked before. I only need 1 for it to be pretty good playable for me for a Planeswalker. And on this one, it's the mill 3 cards part and the lands you control tap for 1 mana of any color part. It's only a 3-color deck, so you're not necessarily as worried about it, and it's in green, so it's good at fixing. But it's just a good way to make sure that you really don't have to think too much about how you use your mana. It's a green-heavy deck, and the other colored spells will sneak up on you sometimes. So having a card like this, admittedly, lets you turn off that part of your brain a little bit that would normally think about it and be concerned about it. And it's just really convenient. The Chromatic Lantern is popular with people for the same reason. And the -2 is mill 3 and get a permanent from the milled cards into your hand. Obviously, that triggers Teval because it'll take a card out of the graveyard. It has to put them in first. So that's decent enough for me. Obviously, the -7 is really, really good. And the +1 gives you something that can protect it. 3/3 with Vigilance, Hexproof, and Haste is pretty strong. So no complaints from me on that. Then we have Wrenn and 7. So Wrenn and 7 is a 5-mana Planeswalker and a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. Her +1 is reveal the top 4 cards of your library, put all lands revealed this way into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. A 0 of put any number of lands from your hand onto the battlefield. tapped. Tapped is important. A -3 that says create a green tree folk creature token with reach, and this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. And a -8 that says return all permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. You get an emblem with you have no maximum hand size. There's a number of really relevant effects on her, on this one. I don't know why I suddenly switched to her. You know what? Ren in 7, Ren has gender things. Ren exists. Ren is a tree. Tree says +1 reveal. The revealing cards part is pretty solid. It puts cards into our graveyard and also gives us a way to select lands. I'm happy with that. The 0 is really good for us. If we just dump a bunch of lands from our hand into play, I'm pretty content with that. We have a lot of things in here that care about landfall triggers. I'm more than happy to put lands into play. And then the 2- abilities are really good, but again, they're not really why I care about the card. I fully expect to activate the 0 once and then have it die immediately. But I'm still more than happy to have it die immediately. Rolling into the creatures, we have 34 of these guys. I'm not going to go over all of them, just some of the key ones, because a lot of the cards in here are the standard like landfall, lands matter package cards. Things like the Dryad of the Elysian Grove, Azusa, Lost but Seeking, Ancient Green Warden. These are all cards that you are probably already familiar with how they interact in a lands synergy way. There's been a lot of precons that have included these cards in them that you have probably picked up or seen people play. You don't really need me to go over that part as much, I don't feel. The more interesting stuff we can go over, we'll start with the Beledros Witherbloom. This is a personal favorite card of mine. I actually at one point owned a copy of Gaia's Cradle and had to sell it at some point just because I needed money. But I put it in Beledros Witherbloom when that set first came out. I had a Beledros Witherbloom deck, and it was a menace. I absolutely adore this card. I love big, scary, cool Gothic dragons. This is going in the commander deck with a big, scary, cool Gothic dragon. Beledros Witherbloom is a 7-mana 4/4 Elder Dragon with flying, and it says at the beginning of each upkeep, create a 1/1 black and green pest that says when it dies, you gain a life. And it says pay 10 life, untap all lands you control, activate only once each turn. A lot of these effects that we have in the deck put those lands into play either from our hand or from the graveyard tapped. So Beledros will give us an opportunity to untap all of those if we need a turn to really basically time walk our opponents. Beledros can functionally do that for us. It's flavorful because it's a dragon, and there's another card that you'll see here in a second that cares about dragons, so I like that. It makes tokens. You're going to find this deck, and most decks that play with lands will care about tokens. This one just does it in a more graveyard kind of way. And the pest tokens are great. On everybody's upkeep, you get one. So if you land a Beledros and he doesn't die immediately by the time it comes back to you, you've probably got 3 or 4 pests ready to go. The other dragon that I was talking about in here is Earthquake Dragon. It's a 15-mana dragon that's a 10/10 with flying and trample. It costs X less to cast, where X is the total mana value of dragons you control. And then you can pay 2 and a green to sacrifice a land to return it from your graveyard to your hand. Obviously, if we mill it, that's a super solid option for us. It puts a land into the graveyard, but our commander will pull that land back out, so that part doesn't really bug us as much, and it gives us 2 potential triggers off of our commander to make zombie tokens. If our commander is the only dragon that the whole game sees, it'll only ever reduce it by 4. So that's still an 11 cost card, but there's a lot of other reanimate options. And for a 10/10 with flying and trample, again, this one's more of a flavor include for me. It just happens to have words that I care about, so I put it in. We're going to scroll down here a little bit. You'll see some of the spicier cards in here. Obviously, there's a Thassa's Oracle. That's part of one of our win cons we'll go over in a second. Eudora. This is one that I really, really like. Eudora Grave Gardener is a 5-cost 5/5 tree folk druid. And it says whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may return it to the battlefield face down under its owner's control. It's a forest land. So this will also trigger our commander every time a creature dies, because it has to hit the graveyard first for that to trigger. It's not a replacement effect, because it says whenever a thing dies, you may do the thing. It doesn't say if a creature would die, do the thing. So this is going to trigger every single time one of our creatures dies, bring us back a land, and net us a 2/2 zombie with our commander. This card's super, super cool, and there's a lot of lands in the deck that turn into creatures that will let you do the same kind of thing and get multiple landfall triggers, multiple lands dying triggers. That matters a lot for things like the Gitrog in here. Yeah, Eudora is just super cool. Very excited to play this card in this deck. And I mentioned earlier this Thassa's Oracle, and that's because there is a couple of combos in the deck. There are two main, like, win the game style combos in the deck. Obviously, we're running Hermit Druid Thassa's Oracle combo. Anyone who isn't familiar, Hermit Druid is 1 and a green for a 1/1 human druid. It says pay green and tap. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a basic land. Put that card into your hand and all other cards that's revealed this way into your graveyard. So obviously, you either play no basic lands in your deck or a really low count of them. And your goal is to just find this guy and activate it so that you can mill your entire graveyard. And then you're going to use the Thassa's Oracle to win. If you don't have the Thassa's Oracle in your hand and it's in your deck, that's okay, because this deck has a couple of options to win even if Thassa's Oracle is in the graveyard. And we'll go over those once we get into the Instants and Sorceries section. We're also going to go with a Gravecrawler combo. This is one the internet's been talking a lot about. Teval says whenever a card leaves your graveyard, you make a 2/2 zombie. Gravecrawler says you can cast it from your graveyard as long as you control a zombie. And the other part of this combo, skipping ahead a little bit, is an artifact called Phyrexian Altar. So with Phyrexian Altar, you can sacrifice the Gravecrawler for a black mana. It hits your graveyard. As long as you already have one of those zombie tokens in play, you can then use that black mana to cast Gravecrawler from your graveyard. When that card leaves, it'll trigger Teval and make a 2/2 zombie. So now you can repeat this process infinitely, because you can keep feeding that to the altar, getting the mana necessary to cast it, and now netting a zombie. This also gives you functionally infinite mana, because those zombies can be fed to the altar as well and give you mana to use. It also just makes you infinite zombies, infinite death triggers. It's one of the ways to win in this deck. That one's less reliant on heavy graveyard synergies. This one's a more likely to pop off early game kind of combo than the Hermit Druid one. The Hermit Druid line is much more late game for this deck, at least. I think that's it in terms of super interesting creatures in the deck. A lot of them are just generic value engines. I put all three of the Titanias in here because they deal with lands and graveyards. Tiller Engine and a couple of other things enter untapped cards are in here because we're running a lot of cards that put lands into play tapped. This just feels really, really good. And if we have multiple instances of those effects in play while Tiller Engine is around, we can just start using Tiller Engine to tap other things and get some beatdown value in with the zombie tokens we're making. Okay, rolling down into our sorceries section here. We've got 7 of them. We're going to go over these 2 first because they're part of our combo we were talking about earlier. We have Dread Return and Durgraf Rebirth. So these are both spells that return a creature from the graveyard to the battlefield, and they both have flashback so they can be cast from our graveyard. Dread Return is a piece of the more classic version of this combo because you don't need mana to be able to do this, you just need creatures. Our commander, luckily for us, makes zombie tokens, so the flashback cost should be pretty easy to provide. Basically what happens is you use the Hermit Druid to mill your whole deck, and let's say Thassa's Oracle is in your graveyard now. Dread Return and or Durgraf Rebirth should both be in your graveyard now as well. And if you have mana, you can just flashback the Durgraf Rebirth and reanimate the Thassa's Oracle. If you don't have mana but you have the bodies, Dread Return. This will let you sacrifice creatures, reanimate the Thassa's Oracle, and win. That's that win con. That's a more late game style win con. Coming over here, we have Creeping Renaissance and Splendid Reclamation. These are kind of both categorized in my head the same way. Splendid Reclamation says return all lands from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. We're milling ourselves, that's going to be really good. And we have a lot of effects that make those come into play untapped, even better. Creeping Renaissance is choose a permanent type and get all cards of the chosen type from your graveyard to hand, and it has flashback. Again, you can use this the same way where you flash it back from your graveyard after you've milled a lot. And this is primarily going to be used to get lands back, but the deck is creature heavy enough that creature's probably the only other type you'd really want to choose. Maybe enchantments. There's some spicy ones. We have Sylvan Scrying, Buried Alive, and Scape Shift as our tutors in the sorceries section. Buried Alive is a more generic tutor. Search for 3 creatures, put them into your graveyard. This is one of the ways you're going to try and maybe turbo out the Gravecrawler line. Is as long as that card's in your graveyard, that combo could potentially be active at any point you get a zombie and the altar. So Buried Alive is in here for that. Scape Shift is another alternate kind of win con. We are running Field of the Dead in the deck, so if you can Scape Shift for a bunch and make a bunch of 2/2 zombies, you still have a good army with which to defend yourself. And then Sylvan Scrying is more specific, look for a land that helps keep you safe. There's the channel lands in here, Boseiju and Otawara. There's also a Glacial Chasm in here, so universally good tutor card. And then our instance section is actually pretty small. We've got 4 of them total for right now. I have Entomb to search for any card and put it into the graveyard. Land, creature, artifact, what have you. Generically good for us. Our graveyard is a second hand, basically. Crop Rotation is another land-specific tutor. I usually use this as functional fog in the deck because Glacial Chasm is in here, and we'll go over what that card does later, but instant speed, get any land from your deck into play, has a lot of versatility in this deck. Constant Mists is just literally a straight up fog with buyback, sacrifice a land. That's not even close to a drawback for us, so we're more than happy to do that. Sacrificing lands is just fine. And then Chain of Vapor is either decent removal, or you can use it on yourself to chain through trying to get some other abilities or sacrificing lands. If you're able to mass reanimate some of your lands even once, having a Chain of Vapor as a way to kind of bounce and replay a bunch of cards is a good way to reaccrue some more value. Scrolling down into artifacts, we have some generic mana rocks in here, as we should, but the highlight artifacts are Amulet of Vigor. This is another card that lets our things come into play untapped. This card is a bit of a menace in Modern for the Amulet Titan line of play. This card is probably the 90% of the reason why Primeval Titan is banned in our format. It's really good. All of our goofy lands coming into play untapped is really, really solid, and it synergizes with that Scare Tiller like we talked about earlier. Also, all those zombies come into play untapped. That's really good. Conduit of Worlds. This card, bonkers. You can play lands from your graveyard, and then you can tap it to choose a non-land permanent in your graveyard, and if you haven't cast a spell this turn, you can cast that one, but then you can't cast anymore. I rarely ever use this card for that line of text, but I prefer to play this over Crucible of Worlds in a green-heavy deck just because I want to be able to use that functionality, and truthfully, I don't feel like tracking down a Crucible of Worlds that's like a $20 or $30 card when I could get an $8 card that is the same thing, but a little bit better if I'm in green. Expedition Map is another generic land tutor. It gets us any land, so we like that. Phyrexian Altar, win condition we discussed earlier. And then Zurin Orb is another favorite card of mine, and depending on how you play your cards, this card can also be used to chain through creature sacrifices. It says sacrifice a land, gain 2 life. Pretty generic, but a lot of the lands we have in here and some of the synergy pieces we have in here make our lands into creatures, and if you have Yadara in play, they also come back again as lands, so you can get multiple triggers off of that. It's a good way to shotgun through a few lands and survive 1 or 2 turns and treat it as almost functional fog, or feed your Gitrog monster a bunch of stuff. And down into the enchantments, we have 8 of them in the deck. Some of these should be fairly obvious stuff. Exploration, play an additional land each turn. Mending of Dominaria, it's a saga, it's been around for a while. You mill some cards, and then when it pops, you return all lands from your graveyard to the battlefield. Not tapped. Not tapped. You don't even need all the talismans. You don't even need the amulet stuff for that. But yeah, this card's good. If it pops for you and you get your lands, great. People kind of forget about sagas for the most part, I've seen in a lot of casual games. So that part will probably just happen, and then everybody will go, oh my god, what happened? And you'll be like, it's been here. Same with Planeswalkers. We've gotten to the point where cards are too exciting, and people aren't paying attention to all of these other cards with extra words on them, and then they just lose games because of it. Excavation and Trade Routes are kind of in the same vein for us. Trade Routes is a little better. It lets us bounce lands to our hand and then discard them for card draw, which is pretty good. Excavation lets anybody pay and sacrifice a land to draw a card. Yeah, I know giving other people card draw doesn't seem very good, but also it's attached to sacrificing a land. And I have purposefully tried in games with this card to get people to sacrifice their lands to draw cards, even when they're like actively trying to draw cards. They're like, no, I don't want to sacrifice my land. I'm more than happy to do it because I love having cards in my hand. So Excavation's in here because it's fun. Mana Bond's in here. This card's really good. On your end step, you can just dump all the lands into play. It's pretty solid. There's a bunch of cards that return lands from graveyard to our hand specifically. This will be a good way to dump them all out and put more cards into our graveyard for Teval to care about. Spelunking is another lands enter untapped card. That's literally the only thing I care about on here. I think there's maybe a cave in the list, but I just really like the untapped stuff. I've played a lot of these style decks, and the lands coming into play tapped always is what proves to put me behind just long enough to get me killed, when I would have been able to win if I had been able to actually use those resources. It's one of the things that I feel like artifacts decks and enchantments decks often get to excel at over decks that focus like lands, is because lands centric cards tend to put them all into play tapped. They force you to kind of wait until the turn after for the most part. You have more hoops to jump through in order to get the immediate value out of being able to use them for mana, unlike things like the enchantments and the artifacts, where a lot of them can be played and immediately do the thing you want them to. So I'm running redundancy in that style of effect. I've got the Walk-in Closet / Forgotten Cellar. Lands from graveyard is obviously good, and when you unlock this door, you can cast spells from your graveyard, and if a card would be put into your graveyard from anywhere this turn, exile it instead. It's a Yawgmoth's Will. That's really good. This is another emergency way to be able to get the Thassa's Oracle out of your graveyard after you've done Hermit Druid line. And then Squandered Resources is one of my favorite Magic cards of all time. Sacrifice a land, add to your mana pool 1 mana of any type that sacrificed land could produce. Obviously, with some of the other cards, those lands can potentially produce any color, but sacrificing lands to get mana is the way that existed for the longest time to get value out of mass reanimating your lands. And it's still absurdly good, so we're still absolutely playing it in this deck. And then we'll scroll down to our lands section. Obviously, there's quite a few interesting pieces we have here. Argoth will go with the Titania up top that melds. It turns into a big, scary, horrible monster that also reanimates all of our lands, so that's pretty good. We have Boseiju and the Otawara as channel lands. We can get them back from graveyard into play tapped via our commander, so channeling them still means you get a land out of it. Pretty good. We're running the Shocks in our respective colors. Oboro, this card is just really, really good. If you get stuck and just need landfall triggers to help protect yourself because they make tokens or something, this card always puts in work. There's a reason it was like an $80 card for the longest time. Dryad Arbor, this is one of those cards that I was talking about that is also a creature. It's also one of the cards you probably could look for with Buried Alive because it's a creature and a land. You can basically get it reanimated with your commander, and that's pretty gangster. But also being able to feed it to the Yadara loop. Generically good card. Dryad Arbor, it's $5. You know it's good. Echoing Depths is a copy land. It enters as a copy of a card, except it's a cave in addition to its other types. So that's our one whole cave in the deck, I think. But cloning lands is pretty good. Field of the Dead, this is the card that we were talking about earlier. If you use Scape Shift and get a bunch of lands into play, even if you sacrifice all of your lands and get exactly the 7 plus Field of the Dead, those lands all enter simultaneously and still see each other. So Field of the Dead does make zombie tokens for each of those happening. So if you can Scape Shift and go get 6 lands that have different names plus Field of the Dead, you also get 7 2/2 zombies, which is really solid. That's something a lot of people didn't realize when this card first came out. It was an M20, and it was this, and then Scape Shift got a reprint at roughly the same time. And I misplayed this card a bunch because I didn't realize that. But yeah, if you have 7 lands, you sacrifice all 7 lands, and you go get Field of the Dead and 6 other lands, they all make a zombie. It's really solid. Foreboding Landscape, just because it's fun. I have copies. I like playing it. Glacial Chasm, this is the card I was talking about finding with crop rotation earlier, because it feels like fog. It has a cumulative upkeep of pay 2 life, and when it comes into play, you sacrifice a land. You can't attack, but all damage dealt to you is reduced to 0. So yeah, this card feels like a fog a lot of the time, and it is a card that people do not play around and do not pack interaction for. The cumulative upkeep does not matter to us basically at all, because we sacrifice it in the upkeep, choosing not to pay for the cumulative, and just attack with our commander, because we can attack again, and get it back from the graveyard into play. It allows us to basically freely protect ourselves, give ourselves a combat step, and still get it back and shield ourselves. People pack land removal and people pack permanence removal, but they don't always think to pack planning for Glacial Chasm. So you'll have plenty of games where it will definitely be the card that wins you the game just because no one else interacts with it. And I do want to add a clarifier. It says damaged is reduced to 0, but you can still lose life. So anything that triggers and loses life, things like Blood Artists, that still hurts you. That's why the cumulative upkeep is 2 life, is because you're paying the 2 life. It's not dealing 2 damage to you. Suva, and we've got Thespian Stage, more clone lands. We are running the Dark Depths combo in here. It is right there. You can basically, this enters with 20 counters on it. When the counters leave, you make a 20/20. Use the Thespian Stage to become a copy of it. Since it's not entering the battlefield, it already has no counters on it, so it will make the 20/20, and you lose both lands in the process, because the legend rule does apply before any of that happens. So for the low cost of 2 mana and 2 lands, you can have a 20/20 with flying and indestructible, which is pretty good. Mystic Sanctuary, this card will enter default untapped with a lot of what we have in the deck, because we have all of those make lands enter untapped synergies, so you don't even necessarily need to care about searching for islands. Shifting Woodland is an MVP in this deck, period. This card will put in some work. It's a land that enters the battlefield tapped unless you control forest, and it taps for a green. It also says Delirium. Pay 2 green, and it becomes a copy of target permanent card in your graveyard until end of turn. Activate only if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. What this functionally means is if this land is in play fairly early, and you mill a really powerful creature or permanent, you can make this land into a hasty version of that. That's the part that matters here. Like Hermit Druid, if we use something like our Buried Alive to search for Hermit Druid and put it into the graveyard, we can turn that land into a copy of Hermit Druid now that doesn't have summoning sickness, and immediately present a way to try and win the game. So that's why we're looking for ways to put cards into our graveyards, is because there's so many ways to interact with it, that we even have lands that give us the potential to just win the game off of it. So, Shifting Woodland, MVP of a card. That price tag does not surprise me. I expect to see it keep climbing. And I think that's actually it, folks. This is the preliminary version of the deck. I really want to fiddle around with it, and it's just kind of hard when the card's not out yet. The set releases in April, so we can't really sit down and actually play with it yet. I haven't finalized what I want to do with everything yet. I know a lot of the pieces I want to play with and the pieces that are really powerful, but I feel like I could still whittle down some of the clunkiness of it. I feel like I have some very high-end mana cost, but I don't have enough lands in this deck, truthfully. I feel like for a deck that cares about lands, I want to run more, but I haven't been able to decide what I want to cut. In fact, I have a couple cards even in the considering section that were just fun to me. Mana Vortex makes people sacrifice lands. We don't care about that because we reanimate our lands, but slowly whittling everybody else's, really good. And then Psychic Vortex has a cumulative upkeep that draws us cards, which is really nice. But it makes us sacrifice lands and discard our hand at the beginning of our turns. So we never actually see... Well, we do. We get the upkeep to draw the card. But at the end of our turns, we lose all of those cards. They're going into our graveyard, though, so that doesn't feel as bad. I don't know. It's just kind of weird and clunky. I like weird and clunky, but not this weird and clunky. So this deck, more than anything, I'm absolutely looking for input on. I have a lot of ideas of what I wanted to do, and I really want to keep that lands sub-theme in it. But I feel like there's wiggle room to streamline it a little bit. So I'm trying to get it in a nice sweet spot where it's not trying to do what the CEDH version of this deck will try to do. Because let's be honest, people are going to build this in CEDH. I'm going to try to build this in CEDH. I think it's neat. I certainly want to try it, at least. But in terms of just a high power casual deck, there's so much potential and wiggle room. I'm excited, is what I'm saying. This card really excites me, and I cannot wait for this set to come out so I can interact with this card and some more. I posted a video previously about a deck for Rowan Scion of War that is a Dragonstorm deck. The card. The literal Dragonstorm card. So that deck is for sure getting some upgrades out of that set. I plan on coming back and revisiting some of these other decks I've talked about as we go along, basically trying to do a recap of them at some point. But yeah, overall, I'm very excited for this card and excited to see what the rest of that set has to offer. If you're interested in this deck and potentially getting a hold of some of these cards before all of that happens, I've got the list over on Moxfield. Moxfield will let you import the deck list to things like TCG and Card Kingdom and buy them all out. So absolutely pick some of these cards, don't pick some of these cards, build your own deck, pre-order some of the cards, because I feel like some of these pieces at least are going to get more expensive once that card actually releases. Or it'll go completely under the radar. There's been a lot of crazy powerful cards this year, and some of them have just gone completely unnoticed because we had more powerful stuff. I know the Final Fantasy commanders have a lot of people excited, so this set might accidentally get a little overshadowed. I hope not, though, because I really like Tarkir, and I really like this commander. And if you really liked this video, you should go ahead and click the subscribe button down below. Go ahead and give us a thumbs up in the little likes area, or a thumbs down. I don't really care. I'll ignore the thumbs down, but clicking the button makes me feel better. So, yeah, you could do that if you want. And then there's a little bell that tells you when we're posting stuff, and it gets really annoying. But you should click that too, because it gives me the availability to continue talking about stuff. It really cannot be hammered home enough that anybody who posts regularly on the internet trying to share content, the greatest resource that we get is people interacting with it. So I'm looking for all the interaction. I'm looking for the opinions. This deck specifically, you can create a profile on Moxfield and comment on decks below. you can leave a comment below on this deck and talk about what your ideas for it are if you are interested in it like I am. Or maybe you think it's a dud. Maybe you think I'm overhyping this card and want to share some opinions and thoughts on that. That's what I'm looking for, the engagement. The internet is just an easier way for me to hold people hostage in a room and talk about the things that I care about. And that's basically what I'm doing here. So, if you're down with all of that and you want to keep watching stuff, hopefully I will see you in the next video. Bye.